welcome back once again for another edition of Pit Stop. In fact, this is going to be our last edition of Pit Stop as the racing season is drawing to an end. Well, what a season it's been here on Pit Stop, and we've been happy to bring you so much all season long. And of course, on this episode, we have the finale to the Gerald Donaldson interview. But up first, just to let you know about a few things. Last week, remember we told you about the Players Limited Forsyth Racing Team's testing of the three drivers, Claude Bourbonnais, David Embringham, and Greg Moore, and Richard Spinard, the new driver consultant, was on hand to observe the three drivers. Well, they fared well, all three of them, in fact, and as far as lap times were concerned, Greg Moore turned a 45.2 as his quickest, and David Embringham got down to a 44.9, but the quickest of the three was Claude Bourbonnais at a 44.7 seconds. Now, the idea of the test wasn't necessarily for speed, it was to see how the drivers could convey information to the team. So, not a factor, the speed in this situation. Last weekend, the Can-Am Midgets ran a special feature at Lancaster Speedway, the Sunoco Racing Fuels Winter Classic, and the winner, Whitby's Jeff Riberty, took all the money at Lancaster last Saturday night. On Sunday, the features were rained out. They'll run them October 1st. Now, up next, we have the second half of the interview with Gerald Donaldson. As you remember, he was with us last week, and we continue to talk about the television coverage. Here is Formula One columnist, Gerald Donaldson. Keeping on the television topic then, and the fact that IndyCar has so much coverage in Europe, is Bernie after his own, like you mentioned, his own standard picture, I guess, with his own group? But do you think there's anything else behind it that Bernie is after with setting up such 120 people and the sophistication that you're mentioning before, which I'd like you to talk about as well, that he has involved with this? Is he after more? Is he after something that CART can't do?
No, I think he's a perfectionist. He's constantly striving to improve the product, which is Formula One racing, and he, like the rest of us, gets fed up with the uneven quality of the telecast, so he wants to have control over that. I don't think there's much more than that in it, really. He always makes fun of IndyCar racing as being an American club race type of thing, which Formula One people tend to do. They look down on it. And the fans get involved in this controversy comparing the two series, and each series has its own supporters, but there's room for both series.
You mentioned, I forget where you did mention it, but there was a scenario where a fan could select a button and go on board with a driver. That's an outstanding or phenomenal sort of technology turn.
Well, during this Foca TV dry run of a telecast, which happened to be the Belgian Grand Prix, which also happened to be one of the best Formula One races in recent years, the Foca TV link was connected to a television exposition in Berlin, and it was an interactive situation where people attending this exposition could plug in to the race with a variety, a dozen different categories of shots. They could plug into a cockpit with a driver, into a pit stop situation, or an overview, a helicopter shot, so it was all interactive. And this is the kind of thing that Ecclestone is exploring, and of course he is himself hugely wealthy, but also Formula One racing is wealthy and can afford the best technology, and he wants to take advantage of all of this. It's just something that I can't imagine to sit back. Right now, of course, ESPN and ESPN2 will do broadcasts of a race, and I can't see it. I don't have a satellite dish, but you can watch all the in-car footage on ESPN2. Now, that's just scratching the surface. What you're talking about is blowing the lid off the whole thing. That's quite an exciting way for us to watch a race. Well, as most fans who have ever been to a race know, you can't, so far, capture anything like the real experience on a television screen. Being at a race is a complete sensory experience. All the senses involved, the smell even of the tires and the oil and the overheated metal, of course the sound. So ultimately, the virtual reality of Formula One racing is difficult to get, or IndyCar racing, any series, on the screen, but someday I presumably will get it.
Sounds exciting. As far as comparing IndyCar drivers and Formula One drivers, the cars between the two series, That's an argument that goes on forever. Who is better, a Formula One driver or an IndyCar driver? And if you look at what happened with Michael, his failed attempt with Formula One, yet Formula One guys come over to IndyCar and do so well, that just adds fuel to that fire. What can you comment about the two?
Yes, I suppose most people base their assessments on the relative failure of Michael Andretti and the success of Nigel Mansell, who reversed the process and just swept the board. It was easy. It looked easy for Mansell, although he found it wasn't easy.
Mm-hmm.
It was hard, but he did it. He was hugely successful. I think the main difference is that Formula One is hugely more competitive. The drivers have to try a lot harder. And the word competitive there has a dual meaning, because IndyCar, because of the nature of the formula, in that anybody can buy approximately the same equipment, is also competitive in that the cars are more closely matched. But the fact that second, third, or fourth, or fifth-rate Formula One drivers can go over to IndyCars and be successful would suggest that the level of capability is perhaps not as high as Formula One. It's a difficult question, but a fascinating one, and people are always arguing about it.
Right. Brazilians are just flocking to IndyCar and the open-wheel North American ranks, maybe because Emerson is their idol, and that's where they want to go. That's who they want to be with. But do you see anything there?
Well, I think, first of all, it's a lot easier to get into IndyCar racing.
That was it. I was just wondering, is the fact that they don't think that they're ever going to make it in Formula One to the caliber that they need to as far as teams?
Yes, it's the passion for motorsport is higher in Brazil than in almost any country you'd care to name. It's part of perhaps the Latin mentality. They love it, and besides Emerson, of course, they had Ayrton Senna as a role model. So you've got hundreds and hundreds of young Brazilian boys who aspire to be racing drivers, and it's a lot easier for them to get into IndyCar racing or other forms of the sport than it is in Formula One, which is, like, in a way, an exclusive club. It costs a lot of money to get there. It costs a lot of money to stay there.
Yep. We've talked about the competitiveness of IndyCar, and so many different drivers can win a race. As a sponsor, as a team, and as a driver, in Formula One, you have to realize that there's only these guys that are going to be up front all the time, and the rest of us are running, are has-beens, also rans. That must get frustrating, but yet they are there time and time again. There is the back of the grid. Mm-hmm. Does it not become a frustrating thing for these guys when you talk to them that they just can't get there?
Yes, but even if you're at the back of the grid, you're in Formula One. And in terms of television exposure, even though IndyCar racing is now in a lot of countries, it's not seen by anywhere nearly the size of the audience that watches Formula One, which is why Formula One can attract all the big budgets and why all the money is there. And for a sponsor, if he's got $1 million to spend on motorsport, it's still better invested if he's an international company who wants international exposure in Formula One on the back of the grid than it is in America. So that's how this series keeps going financially, but it is hugely frustrating for the backmarkers because they need exposure to get the budgets, to get the money, to be able to build the equipment, to get them to the front of the grid. And they can't get the exposure because they're on the back of the grid where nobody ever sees them. Halfway through this season, somebody published the actual television time of sponsors on cars. And of course, Williams and Benetton, because of Michael Schumacher and Damon Hill and Coulthard.
Just picture this graph.
they were way up here, and teams like Pacific or even McLaren was way down at the bottom.
Wow.
Because McLaren had done nothing. They've
Right,
improved since. So team managers, sponsor, everybody is watching these television exposure figures, and the sport exists for television. Formula One does.
But right now, all you see is the guys out in front, and the coverage somewhat gets boring. Yet there are some great battles back there, and maybe that's another thing that Bernie's after, is trying to get those cameras back into the grid.
That's a good point. It's unfair that some of these battles don't get seen because they're often much more exciting and intense than they are at the front. And that's where you need a knowledgeable TV production crew to focus on the battles. And also, if you have control of this exposure, as you would if you were running the show, as Focus TV hopes to do, then you can guarantee sponsors that your car will be on camera sometime. And because even if a guy is not in a battle, he may be running dead last, as Pedro Paulo Diniz often does in his 40 course. Not that he's trying hard. I've watched these back markers up close, and they're trying just as hard as they possibly can, and nobody sees them. So it's an injustice, too.
Coming up next season, a lot of rumor about Alain Prost, and he's testing again this week. Do you know anything?
I do know that he's very seriously considering a comeback. He's not only testing the McLaren Mercedes-Benz at this moment, he's testing himself to see if he has the desire, the speed to come back. And by the European Grand Prix at the Nürburgring, he will have decided, McLaren will have decided whether or not he is coming back. He may choose not to race full-time and will keep the role he has now as a test advisor to McLaren, but he does want to race if he can get the motivation and the assurances that the equipment is good enough for him to continue his winning ways, the most successful Formula One driver ever.
I fear for these guys, though, when they do decide to come out of retirement. They've had such a successful career, why not leave it at that?
It seems that Formula One racing in particular, although IndyCar racing too, where you have Mario Andretti and Emerson Fittipaldi and these guys staying on and on, it's like a drug. They don't want to give it up. It's addictive. I know Prost has said this year he works for French television as a color commentator of Formula One races, and one of my colleagues sits beside him in the commentary booth, and Alain is just tense and is frustrated, and he'd much rather be out there in a car than watch it. He's having withdrawal symptoms, and maybe it'll be just too powerful for him to resist, and he'll come back.
So the suggestion is perhaps that he retired too soon and he made a mistake.
Yes, he did retire before he wanted to, and the reason for that was he retired after winning his 4th World Championship with the Williams-Renault team, because Williams had hired Ayrton Senna for the next season, and of course the two of them never get along. Which brings up an interesting point again, because even though those two drivers, the two greatest in the history of the sport, I guess, had differences throughout their careers, when Ayrton Senna was killed, Alain Prost was devastated and said, out of respect for my fallen comrade, I will never again sit in a Formula One car. Well, he's already sat in one, and he's now considering racing one again, and he's talked about this. It's difficult for him in a moment of extreme passion. He made this statement, but he may have to change his mind.
Yeah, well, statements get made all the time either under passion or anger, and we all know that when cooler heads prevail, things change. But what about Coulthard? Of course, the bearing went and he spun, but before that, the spin on the warm-up was his fault. Some people speculating about his ability.
Well, he did. That was a hugely embarrassing mistake on the warm-up lap at Monza to spin out. He was on pole position, a remarkable performance in qualifying to get that pole, because he was half a second ahead of some of the biggest names in the sport and fully deserving of it. And then to spin out, he said there had been a supporting race before that, and the marshals had put down cement dust, and he wasn't expecting this, but still a really well-experienced driver would have been aware of that. So he was very embarrassed by that, but then there was on that first lap accident, and the race was restarted so he could start on the spare. The second accident was not his fault. He was leading the race easily. That could have been the race that he would win, because he had been dominant in qualifying and practice. bad luck put him out. He is a very big talent, but he needs to win this year. Everyone agrees, I think even he does, that he's got the best car. The Williams Renault is the class of the field this year. So he'll be trying hard before the season finishes to get that win. But then again, he may be required to play a supporting role to his teammate who's fighting for the World Championship.
Mm-hmm. And as far as his teammate is concerned, see some real attitude changes this year in both Hill and Schumacher. Schumacher last year seemed like such a real genuine guy and a real happy to be in Formula One kind of a guy, and I think obviously the pressure of being the champion has taken its toll on him. He doesn't seem that way anymore to me.
He's a changed boy, so is Damon Hill. Being their intensely competitive struggle together has changed them. The media pressure has changed them. But it's a fascinating battle they've had. On the one hand, you've got Schumacher, one of the great talents, natural talents. Damon Hill, not so great. Staying competitive with Schumacher through grit, determination, bravery. So it is a fascinating battle, but because of this disparity in their capabilities, we are getting these accidents, I think, is my interpretation of what is happening. Damon is trying so hard all the time to keep up with Schumacher or to get ahead of him that he's at the teetering on the brink all the time. Schumacher, with a naturally more gifted driver, has more room for error and to play. Damon doesn't. Consequently, you get him ramming Schumacher and making mistakes trying to overtake him and so on. But it's one of the great epic battles of the last few years.
Certainly, right. It goes back to the big McLaren fighting days as well with Senna and Prost. What about Johnny Herbert? 2 wins, both because of DNFs by other drivers. Is he getting enough credit? He's certainly there to take the win.
Yes, he is. Both of his wins came when Hill and Schumacher crashed, or actually when Hill crashed into Schumacher, come to think of it. Johnny Herbert has for years been touted, particularly by the British press, as a potential world champion, only needing the right equipment to prove himself. Well, this year, he has much better equipment, but he's always a second and a half, 2 seconds slower than Michael anytime in the race, in qualifying. So in that sense, he hasn't come through, but he told us before the Italian Grand Prix, in fact, it was an outburst, that he was really angry with the Benetton team for not giving him enough testing, for not... he said he felt like an outcast. They weren't giving him what he needed. So he dug himself into a huge hole prior to the Italian Grand Prix, and fortunately he won the race. I think, in reality, Johnny Herbert is about the 5th or 6th best driver this year, and that's where he finishes, except when the 5 or 6 guys ahead of him are out, he's there to pick up the pieces. But one of the remarkable things that's happened, he's now 3rd in the championship.
Right.
And has a good mathematical chance of actually winning it. He's a good, steady driver.
He had such a disastrous crash to come back from.
Yes, he must be given full credit for that. I think it was 1988 or 89 in Formula 3000 at Brands Hatch in England. He had an enormous accident that literally shattered his legs. He's never really recovered from that. He still walks with a limp. And he doesn't complain about it, but people know that it set him back and probably robbed him of a lot of his potential. So you've got to give him full credit for that. And he's a nice guy, too. As a charming character, a lot of fun, so he's got a lot of fans.
How about some Formula One stories, anecdotes that you have? You must have just a closet full of them. Anything in particular that you like to tell? Stories of drivers or situations within Formula One?
Well, it's endlessly fascinating. One of the old adages about Formula One is that the real racing takes place in the paddock at each race, Grand Prix weekend. Never mind what goes on the track. There's so much political maneuvering and playing around in the paddocks, and it is very fascinating to see this going. The drivers are often involved in it, but more often they have their managers doing all this maneuvering. But in fact, it was at the Belgian Grand Prix when all of these seats remained open that the managers and the drivers were darting in and out of other opposition motorhomes, trying to make last-minute deals. And it's surprising how impromptu a lot of this is. Even though you're dealing with millions of dollars and momentous decisions, they just happen on the spur of the moment. So with a colleague, I was standing on a height above the paddock, looking down at the motorhomes, and you could see these figures darting in and out. It was just...
Running into each other on their way through and out.
Trying to be furtive about it, hiding, because they didn't want to see, for instance, David Coulthard was in talking to Ron Dennis in McLaren over here, and he doesn't want Frank Williams to see him doing this. All of this kind of thing was going on.
Right, the silly season.
Yes, and this has been one of the silliest because you had so many vacancies up for grabs next year. But there's always something like that. In fact, only recently, in the last couple of races, have we had really exciting races, which takes one's mind off of all the silly political maneuvering and back onto the track where I think it should be.
Right. Paul Tracy's father, Tony, was at Montreal talking with people. That was shown on TV. And we all know that Paul's back with Penske for 96, but beyond that, we don't know about Paul. Do you know of anything that happened there in Montreal with Tony?
Paul Tracy, Tony Tracy, I know, and Paul, for that matter, their goal has always been to get to Formula One. Paul raced karts in Europe. He actually raced against Michael Schumacher and a lot of the current Formula One heroes. He acquitted himself very well. He was good. But for one reason or another, he hasn't made the jump yet. And he came along at it just after Michael Andretti fiasco, which set the transferal of IndyCar drivers over to Formula One back by years.
Mm-hmm.
Up until that point, a lot of people were interested in Paul Tracy, several top teams. He did have a Benetton test, and I think he probably still has an option with them, but of course that's in the past now, and he's, as you say, staying in Formula One, or in IndyCars, back to the Penske team. So, but I wouldn't be surprised that in the future, especially if Jacques Villeneuve acquits himself well, that Paul Tracy will be in Formula One.
We have two of them there. That'd be pretty exciting stuff.
It's interesting, the Canadians do have a reputation, mainly because of Gilles Villeneuve, of being hard racers. And this is the perception among Formula One team managers, that Canadians have this capability that perhaps other nationalities don't.
It's been a while since we've had Alan Berg in Formula One, and he's doing quite well in Mexico now, making a name for himself there. But how long has he actually been out of the Formula One scene?
It was 1986 that he did his few races with Osella. At that time, Osella was hopelessly uncompetitive. But interestingly enough, prior to that, in 1984, Alan Berg finished second in the British Formula 3 Championship, which was won by Ayrton Senna. So he had done very well over there. And then, at the end of that season, he was offered a ride by the Arrows team. And I remember at the time Alan scurrying around looking for Canadian sponsorship. He couldn't find it, but a young Austrian fellow came along with the money, and his name was Gerhard Berger. So Alan could have been there, except for money, perennial problem.
Yeah, the one that gets everybody is money at the right time, at the right place. Wow, that's something. Well, of course, Jacques has made it. He's going to be there, and we're all excited about that. I'm sure Montreal, the box office, was getting phone calls right off the hook, burning the lines come that announcement.
Not just in Montreal, because of Gilles Villeneuve's popularity around the world. It's an international thing, and an enormous amount of attention will be focused on the son of the famous father next year.
You excited about next year yourself?
Oh yes, not just because of Jacques Villeneuve, although it'll be terrific for me as the only Canadian over there, but because of all of those driver changes in the other teams, more competitiveness, possibility of 3 cars, some of the top teams. Driver changes, new drivers. It should be one of the most interesting in years.
And this one's not over yet. We've got some interesting battles, I'm sure, left with Schumacher and Hill, in spite of the fact that Formula One has slapped these potential suspensions on them. But we're in for some exciting stuff for the end of the season.
Oh, yes.
Yeah.
Two excellent races in a row, and I don't see any reason why that shouldn't continue.
Great. Well, I hope that our relationship here on Pit Stop can continue, Gerald. It's been a pleasure again. Managing to keep you for another segment of conversation with you. I always, like I said, enjoy the chance now that I've had to meet with you and talk twice with you. Appreciate it very much. Thanks.
Thanks for having me.
Excellent. Great job. Thank you.
Bye.
And our thanks to Gerald for coming in and giving us that rather extensive interview. Now, as I mentioned at the top of the show, this is our final show for the season, and our thanks to all of the guests all season long, as we've been able to bring you quite a rather extensive list of guests as Pit Stop has progressed throughout the summer, and of course to all of you for tuning in all summer long. We've been bringing you the Indy cars, Indy Lights, Trans Ams, and IMSA racing, and most importantly, Canadian racing and local Canadian racing and drivers. And speaking about local racing, don't forget September 24th, and October 1st, the first and second parts of the final show from the Motorsport International Speedway Thunder, the Invitational, at 8 o'clock. You'll be able to see those on September 24th and October 1st. Once again, on behalf of everybody involved with Pit Stop for this season, thanks very much for being a part of our show, and have yourself a fantastic winter. Take care. If you have any questions or comments, write to Pit Stop, care of Rogers Community 10, 301 Marwood Drive, Oshawa, Ontario, L1H1J4, or give us a call on our response line, 905-436-3500, and leave a recorded message.